Hello, I'm Phil Turek. Less than 2 weeks ago, I gave a presentation at a Mars Society convention. The title of my talk was Mars as a Societal Depolarizer Tool. Now, perhaps the recording was made correctly, perhaps not. But what I am doing in this video is making a fresh recording of that presentation. I have tweaked up a couple of slides and I've changed my messaging on one of the slides. And hopefully this is slightly more refined and a little bit better version of it. All right, so here we go. The intended audience for this, by the way, are members of the Mars Society, in particular, citizens in the United States who are involved with the Mars Society, and the general public, if you're curious about people who are aspiring to settle Mars. That's what the Mars Society is working on, and this presentation is part of that group effort. The big idea in my presentation is that the United States is working through some issues right now that show up in the way our government is somewhat dysfunctional. And I'm going to put forward my interpretation of why we're the way we are, then what could be done about it, both as an individual outside of the Mars Society, if you want to tackle a social issue, and what the Mars Society could do as a collective group to try and make progress on our ultimate goal is to expand human civilization so that we have settlements on Mars. Again, here's the outline of what I'm going to be doing, why, what you can do individually, what we can do collectively. To begin, I claim the United States is disintegrating. My evidence to support that claim is this graph here showing average life expectancy in the United States as a function of time over the past 40 plus years. The red line is the United States. The gray lines represent our peers on this planet, other first world countries, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so forth. And you can see that we have been falling behind our peers for decades now. And lately, it's become much more pronounced how life expectancy in the United States is significantly shorter on average than it is for our peers. My reasoning as to why this evidence supports my claim begins with Zelensky's doctrine. And here's the Wikipedia definition, but what he's saying is that when humanity expands into a new territory, the first settlers there to have a viable, self-sustaining society really set the cultural and social geography for that region for centuries to come. And it doesn't matter how small the initial settlement is. Okay, so armed with that thought. And in fact, before we go any further, I want you to take a moment and pause and think about this. This talk is really focused on the United States. And so I'm going to presume that there's something about the United States that you are proud of. So take a moment, think back over the past 200 plus years of US history. And what is something that comes to mind that makes you proud of what the United States has done? Okay, so take a moment and do that. Hold that thought. I'll come back to it much later if I remember to. All right, so the United States, when it was first formed as a union of 13 individual colonies, had as sort of the myth that kept us together or brought us together was really expressed in the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. And that said, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That very, inspiring set of words is what united us for a long time. However, out of the original colonies that made up the United States, not everyone really deeply bought into that. So there is a second narrative that's really been dominating the United States behavior over these centuries. And that is quite different. And it says, no, the United States is just a federation of these Anglo-Saxon groups, and that slavery is okay. And the reason, slavery is okay is, well, historically, the ancient Greeks had slaves, the ancient Romans had slaves. During the Middle Ages in Europe, you had dukes and the peasants were pretty much like slaves. So it's not a bad thing. It's where the wealthy landowners, call the shots, and the rest of us, slavery is okay for us. Now, why is it that we have these two quite different competing narratives about who the United States is? Again, from Zelensky's doctrine, it comes down to the fact that the United States was never founded by one homogeneous culture. It was a collection of different colonies that were rivals with each other at times, cooperating with each other at other times. What you're looking at right now is a map put together by the Nationhood Lab, and it has a resolution down to the county level. And what they've identified is that there are 11 major subnations based on culture and social practices that make up the United States. Two of the more famous ones I would like to point out are Yankeedom, the blue ones towards the north, and the Deep South, the deep red ones down in the southern eastern part of the United States. Those two subnations actually went to war. That was the United States Civil War taking place in the 1860s. Here, I've tried to take the information from the Nationhood Lab and compress it down to a single bullet for each of the 11 different subnations, trying to, just give you something to hang your hat on about, gee, what is that group like? In just a few words. So in Yankeedom, they were founded by the Puritans, and they felt that, man is in God's image, governments are imperfect, but by working together collectively, we can improve government and make it even better. So you deny your own needs to take care of the common good. The Deep South was founded by a totally different culture, basically agrarian groups that had the dukes being the wealthy landowners who made all the rules. There was no federal government that peasants could turn to for help. And the peasants were basically like slaves in a sense. All right. And you might take a moment to identify what county you're from and what subnation you're assimilated into. And maybe you agree or disagree with that's the way people behave in that particular county overall. This is a second piece of evidence. Again, it's from the Nationhood Lab, and it shows what life expectancy is in the United States by county, so by different subnations, the 11 different subnations. And what it's showing is that there is a difference of more than 10 years in life expectancy based on what culture you belong to, okay, what culture you're in. And the quote here from some former health official for a state is pointing out, sure, your life expectancy is determined by whether or not you drink and smoke and exercise and do those things. But the vast majority of it is really determined by the culture that you're living in. And if they have an attitude that is not conducive to everyone caring about each other as a society, well, then you're on your own much more, and your life expectancy tends to be depressed because of that. Note the two young wrestlers. They're circling each other here as this wrestling match begins. And I want to point out that political parties also wrestle with each other. They follow their cultures, okay? They don't lead their cultures. They represent the cultures where they're voted into office. Over the centuries, here in the United States, political parties basically put out a major platform, at least every 4 years, saying what they're for, what they're against. And then the other political parties, we only have two main ones in the US, basically put out an opposing political view. And the point of this little video and the map of the United States is to point out that these political parties circle around each other politically over time. When the Civil War broke out, one of our major political parties really represented the Yankeedom values and said, oh, government is good, slavery is bad. And the other major political party represented the Deep South cultural values that said, well, we don't really want a strong federal government. Just leave us alone. And by the way, slavery is okay. More than 100 years later, those two major political parties have basically reversed their platforms because they're circling around each other over time. This is a pretty depressing slide, and I'm going to change my messaging on it from what I presented almost 2 weeks ago now. The second major reason, in my opinion, why the United States is so polarized these days has to do with fear. When a person is afraid, maybe they're worried about their job or the economy as a whole, or the other type person who lives down the street, or the homeless person who lives on the sidewalk. If you're in a state of anxiety and fear, you become vulnerable to being influenced in sort of not a good way. So for human beings, there's what we're instinctively programmed to do in a crisis situation, and then what we strive to do intellectually when we're calm and we're well-fed and we're not being bombed, and we can work on exercising our critical thinking skills, okay? So imagine this. You are part of a deeply devout religious group in the United States, and your group decides their project now is going to be to work to make their religion the official religion of the United States. If you are not familiar with the United States, we do not have an official religion. In fact, we have separation of church and state as one of our founding principles. But your religious group says, no, we're going to change it. And so you're a member of this group, and you go to your church, down into your church basement, you're eating your donuts, you're making your plans with your fellow parishioners. But a rumor is circulating around that says your parishioners have found out that there are groups that are opposed to your project here. In fact, they might even be violently opposed to it. They're the non-believers, the others, everyone who's not part of your group. So your group is a little on edge, a little anxious, a little uncomfortable, a little bit fearful. Under those conditions, imagine if this rich, spoiled 7-year-old brat comes down the staircase and shouts, "Fire!" All of us humans have been pre-programmed by Mother Nature to believe first and take the time to do your critical thinking skills later when you're not in danger, okay? So under those conditions, we're not going to spend time wondering, well, that wasn't the fire chief who came down here. That was that spoiled kid who tends to, do pranks all the time. No, if you're already susceptible because you're already anxious and afraid, you're going to do what Mother Nature has taught us to do instinctively. And that is, get out of there. It might be a real fire. You can think about it later. What dictator wannabes have maybe intuitively realized is that if they can get a group of people to be afraid and or angry, then they can feed them a lie, and the people don't have time to exercise their critical thinking skills to realize, that is just not true. And what they can do, they have to, they can build from that. And research has shown that your brain actually reprograms itself to go in that direction because it takes less mental effort right? It's easier to just believe than it is to do critical thinking. That's why school is so hard for some students. They have to constantly be challenged to exercise their critical thinking. So for a wannabe dictator, they have to keep their base in a state of fear and or anger. And what they can do then is build an entire alternate reality for that base and maintain power. So what's in the white boxes here is sort of like the checklist. So if you want to become a dictator, then these are the different things you would have to do in a democracy to keep yourself in power. And break the rules that say, oh no, we have a constitution. Oh no, 2-year term limit. Okay. So those are the check boxes. And here in the United States, people have grown afraid over the years. And so it's a large segment. There are tens of millions of voters in the United States who have succumbed to being afraid. And they are in this worldview that says they're being threatened, they're under attack, and they turn to the leader who's going to save them from all this. So whether it's the one TV channel that you watch, or the one website that you trust, or the one tweet that you'll follow, or the one station on the radio, talk show guy, whatever it is, they do your thinking for you. And now your life becomes simple. It's just like, oh, I don't have to think about whether they're right or wrong. I just need to believe them. And they do my thinking. I'm always kept afraid and angry all the time, stirred up by them. But, you have this worldview. They connect dots for you that really have no connection to each other. And you see maybe conspiracies everywhere. You're constantly being threatened and angry. So for the Mars Society, this is a big challenge. Remember when I asked you to take a moment to think about something positive in the United States history? I'm going to confess to you that I had a secret desire about what you would think of, particularly if you're a member of the Mars Society. I was secretly hoping that you would think of the time that the United States sent 12 US citizens to walk on the moon as being a positive accomplishment. The Apollo program of the 1960s. Yes, there really was an Apollo program. Yes, a dozen US citizens walked on the moon. That was a result of different groups working together to make it happen. It was not the result of one group saying, oh, we will never surrender to this other group, their culture or their ideals. Right now in Congress, there's a lot of conflict going on where one group says we will never surrender to work with the other group, even though the other group is made up of half the population of the United States. Wow. All right. So for the Mars Society, people who are living in fear, okay, bad news is they're not deprogrammable. Okay. It's like maybe the third religion being created in the United States in our history already, where these people have their chosen one. And their only job is to believe and follow their chosen one. And for people who don't buy into that, they look at it and say, no, that's a wannabe dictator. And you really should. There's no point in getting into an argument over this. People who, religiously believe something, they religiously believe it. And you can't argue a person out of their religious beliefs. So there's nothing that the Mars Society can do that would make different political parties, people who are, seeing the world through the lens of a chosen one, cooperate with the people who see the world through the lens of a wannabe dictator to actually work together to create a settlement on Mars. Now, the people who studied this stuff said, the good news is eventually truth wins out over lies on a historical timescale. Okay, so people who become dictators by lying to their populations, eventually the truth comes out. Bad news is we, as a Mars society, can't really do anything about that. Just let it go. It's been said that, again, by the researchers, a major disruptive event would have to take place for people to begin to question their own worldview. Okay, a major disruptive event. And that's not something we're going to engineer. Now, the other part that I talked about, how the United States is polarized because of our different cultures, okay, the 11 different major subnations, that is something that the Mars Society could work with. All right. So before I go on, I just want to show this quote from Carl Sagan, which says, instead of being afraid of other people, cherish the fact that we're all human beings. It's a big universe out there. The Earth is a little tiny speck of dust out of this cosmic vastness. And we really should not be afraid of other human beings. We shouldn't be fighting over land and other resources. Okay. Dr. Zubin gave an interesting talk very recently where he pointed out that if resources really were finite, then our standard of living today should be much, much worse than when there were few people on the planet. In reality, our standard of living today has been steadily increasing over time. And why is that? Because as there are more people living on the planet, there are more critical thinkers, there are more inventors, there is more technology coming out. And thanks to global communication, once something great is invented anywhere on this planet, it very rapidly spreads everywhere throughout this planet, and everyone gets to benefit from these new inventions and new technology. So our standard of living is going up. So instead of viewing people as, everyone is your enemy because you're competing with them for resources, everyone is actually your friend because they're helping you invent how to, increase your standard of living and your wealth. Okay. Interesting talk by him.